Hello, everybody. Welcome to Jaipur, Colson. We're all in for a treat today. We're with Colson Whitehead, who, as you know, is a wonderful writer, much acclaimed, much distinguished. The book that is the title of this session, The Underground Railroad, won did the double, as they would say in the UK, by winning both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer. Colson Whitehead is a wonderful writer, a teacher of writing as well, and I think it's a great treat that we have him with us here in Jaipur. Colson, just initially, this is your first time in Jaipur and India. Any initial impressions?
No, it's been great. You know, I got here 2 days ago, and the festival, everyone is very lively and welcoming. Usually I spend my afternoons at home weeping over my regrets, so this is a nice change of pace for me anyway, to be out of the house.
Well, certainly no regrets here. So to turn to your book, it came initially out of the idea of taking a metaphor, the Underground Railroad, which was a method for slaves in the 19th century from escaping the South to get to the North, and it was referred to as the Underground Railroad. It was really a metaphor, but your idea was to make this metaphor real. How did you arrive at that conceit?
Yeah, well, you know, when you first hear about the Underground Railroad as a kid, you think it's a literal train. You know, the words are so evocative. And then hopefully your teacher explains how it actually worked. In real life, it was a network of people who helped slaves escape from the South to the free states in the North. And you might take them 100 miles in your wagon or hide them in your cellar until they could take the next journey. And I guess they got the name from a slave master woke up one day, saw that a slave was gone, and said, it's as if she disappeared on Underground Railroad. And it just seemed, wouldn't it be a weird idea to make that metaphor into a literal train? What kind of story could I get out of it? And that's a premise, not so much of a story, so I added the element that each state that Cora, our protagonist, goes through is a different state of American possibility, sort of like Gulliver's Travels.
Right, so the Underground Railroad, in its physical form as you imagine it, is not a sort of smooth, efficient system. It's fragmented, it has its detours, it's broken in places. Could you talk a little bit about how you conceived this railroad itself?
Well, I mean, you know, it's one thing to have that idea, another thing to sort of flesh it out. And for me, you know, the Underground Railroad is the sort of least interesting thing about the book. It's really a portal to get Cora from one state to another. And I think a previous version of me, a younger version, would have spent a lot of time on who built the tunnels and how did it work and who are the engineers. I think, you know, I really want to focus on Cora and her story. And so the railroad becomes a small part, and each new world that she enters into in Virginia, in North Carolina, becomes a more important sort of stage or arena for her experience.
So Cora is the main character of the book. Initially she's 15 years old, I think, in the initial part of the book. I read somewhere that you had initially, when you'd begun fleshing out this idea at a much earlier age, that you had imagined writing about a man in his 20s. How did you get to Cora?
Well, you know, I mean, I had the idea in the year 2000, and I thought that if I'd started it back then, I would have screwed it up. I didn't think that I was a good enough writer to pull it off in a technical sense. I didn't think I was like mature enough as a person to sort of deal with the subject. And so, say 2003, I would think it's a man running away. 2006, in the back of my head, it's a husband looking for a spouse, a parent looking for a child. And then when I finally committed to writing the book in 2014, I'd never had a mother-daughter dynamic before, so that seemed worthy of doing. You know, I tried to do different things. And then there's a very famous a slave narrative by Harriet Jacobs, and she writes very movingly about the dilemma of the female slave. When a slave girl becomes a slave woman, she enters into a new, more terrible form of slavery. She's now subject to her master's desires, if she wasn't already. She's supposed to pump out babies because more babies means more slaves, more money for her master. And it's a different dilemma than face the male slave, and that just seemed worthy of picking up. And also, I'd had like 6 male protagonists in a row, so I didn't want to do the same shit all the time.
The early part of the book is sort of set in this brutal plantation in Georgia, and this is where we get to meet Cora. I wonder if I could compel you to read from the book and maybe give our audience a flavor of the narrative itself.
So, yeah, we start in Georgia, which is the sort of realistic part of the book. When she gets on the train, we enter into a more fantastic realm. But before I started playing with history and how things actually worked, I wanted to get it right. So this is my, hopefully, realistic depiction of a plantation in Georgia. And the occasion is old Jockey's birthday. He's the oldest slave in the plantation. And whenever he senses a need for release, in the slave quarter, he'll declare, "It's my birthday," and they have a feast. And, oh, okay.
I mean, this is quite a tempestuous section of the book.
Right.
And I think the elements agree.
The music stopped. The circle broke. Sometimes a slave will be lost in a brief eddy of liberation, in the sway of a sudden reverie among the furrows, or while untangling the mysteries of an early morning dream, in the middle of a song on a warm Sunday night. Then it comes always, the overseer's cry, the call to work, the shadow of the master, the reminder that she's only a human being for a tiny moment across the eternity of her servitude. The Randall brothers, the masters, had emerged from the great house and were among them. The slaves stepped aside, making calculations of what distance represented the right proportion of fear and respect. Godfrey, James's houseboy, held up a lantern. According to old Jockey, James favored the mother, stout as a barrel and just as firm in countenance, and Terence took after the father, tall and owl-faced, perpetually on the verge of swooping down on prey. In addition to the land, they inherited their father's tailor, who arrived once a month in his rickety carriage with his samples of linen and cotton. The brothers dressed alike when they were children and continued to do so into manhood. Their white trousers and shirts were as clean as the laundry girl's hands could make them, and the orange glow of the lantern made the men look like ghosts emerging from the dark. "Master James," Jockey said. His good hand gripped the arm of his chair as if to rise. "Master Terence." "Don't let us disturb you," Terence said. "My brother and I were discussing business and heard the music. I told him, 'Now that is the most god-awful racket I've ever heard.'" The Randalls were drinking wine out of goblets of cut glass and looked as if they'd drained a few bottles. Cora searched for Caesar's face in the crowd. She didn't find him. He hadn't been present the last time the brothers appeared together on the northern half. You did well to remember the different lessons of those occasions. Something always happened when the Randalls ventured into the quarter, sooner or later, a new thing coming that you couldn't predict until it was upon you. James left the daily operations to his man Connolly and rarely visited. He might grant a tour to a visitor, a distinguished neighbor or curious planter from another neck of the woods, but it was rare. James rarely addressed his niggers, who'd been taught by the lash to keep working and ignore his presence. When Terence appeared on his brother's plantation, he usually appraised each slave and made a note of which men were the most able and which women the most appealing. Content to leer at his brother's women, he grazed heartily upon those of his own half. "I like to taste my plums," Terence said, prowling the rows of cabins to see what struck his fancy. He violated the bonds of affection, sometimes visiting slaves on their wedding night to show the husband the proper way to discharge his marital duty. He tasted his plums and broke the skin and left his mark. Terence scratched his cane in the dirt. It'd been his father's cane, topped with a silver wolf's head. Many remembered its bite on their flesh. Terence said, "Then I recollected James telling me about a nigger he had down here, could recite the Declaration of Independence. I can't bring myself to believe him. I thought perhaps tonight he can show me, since everyone is out and about, from the sound of it." "We'll settle it," James said. "Where is that boy, Michael?" No one said anything. Godfrey waved the lantern around pathetically. Moses was the boss unfortunate enough to stand closest to the Randall brothers. He cleared his throat. "Michael dead, Master James." Michael, the slave in question, had indeed possessed the ability to recite long passages. According to Connolly, who heard the story from the nigger trader, Michael's former master was fascinated by the abilities of South American parrots and reasoned that if a bird could be taught limericks, a slave might be taught to remember as well. Merely glancing at the size of their skulls told you a nigger possessed a bigger brain than a bird. Michael had been the son of his master's coachman, had a brand of animal cleverness, the kind you see in pigs sometimes. The master and his unlikely pupil started with simple rhymes and short passages from popular British versifiers. They went slow over the words the nigger didn't understand, and if truth be told, the master only half understood. But they made miracles, the tobacco farmer and the coachman's son. The Declaration of Independence was their masterpiece. Michael's ability never amounted to more than a parlor trick, delighting visitors before the discussion turned, as it always did, to the diminished faculties of niggers. His owner grew bored and sold the boy south. By the time Michael got to Randall, some torture or punishment had addled his senses. He was a mediocre worker. He complained of noises and black spells that blotted his memory. In exasperation, Connolly beat out what little brains he had left. It was a scourging that Michael was not intended to survive, and it achieved its purpose.
Wow. And that scene, a very powerful scene that continues, is in the midst of a really devastating section about the brutality of a plantation. And to be true to that history, histories of rape, dismemberment, murder, all sorts of violence. What was that like, both in the research and in the writing, of immersing yourself in that history of brutality?
Well, I mean, the hard part was sort of reckoning with the research. You know, I first learned about slavery by watching Roots when I was 8 years old. My parents made us all gather around the TV to see Alex Haley's miniseries. In college, I studied history and had a sort of late teenage reckoning with slavery. But coming to the material in my 40s as a parent, I had a different sort of understanding of what it meant to lose a child, to see your child beaten, sold off, you never seen him again. What it would mean for a child to see that happen to a parent. And I think I felt a duty before I started bringing in fantasy to get it right. And so it was not going to be like Gone with the Wind, where some white lady's being self-actualized against the backdrop of slavery. Like, oh, they're burning my house down. Good, they should burn your house down. You're a fucking slave master, and you should, get everything bad that happens to you. So I was going to put it on the page. I think I had to reckon with that. It's sort of a miracle I'm here. It's a miracle that this or that ancestor wasn't killed on the Middle Passage on the plantation, and they somehow protected their children who grew up to have a child. And so the hard part was realizing what I'd have to put on the page to be realistic.
For me, one of the great joys of fiction is actually the experience of learning, and I learned a lot from the book, from all the research you did. So you talk about the section in the plantation initially as a sort of realistic section, but there's a lot of real world stuff that goes into future sections, whether it's 19th century eugenics or the sort of logistics of slave catching. How did you decide where you wanted to adorn reality with a kind of fictive imagination, and how did you decide where you wanted to be exactly true to a record?
Sure. I mean, hopefully over the years, the more I write, the better I get at, figuring out how to deploy research in an artistic way in the book, as opposed to sort of dumping it in a very unartful manner. So I had a bunch of things I knew I wanted to talk about: eugenics, forced sterilization, the parallels between the Holocaust and slavery. And so as I was coming up with the different characters of each state, the white supremacist state of North Carolina, the black utopia state of Indiana, I was figuring out where all these different sort of historical uh, tidbits could go. And so how, in South Carolina, Cora finds herself in a seemingly benevolent state where black folks are given jobs and housing, education in a sort of play on the Great Society programs of the 1960s. So I moved that into that section. I also bring in the forced sterilization, which happened in the late 19th century, early 20th century, to prevent poor people, people of color, the feeble-minded from having more children. They would sterilize women. And so that, I put that in conversation with the social programs of the 60s, and it's not anachronistic, but they're in conversation with each other. How do these government programs speak to the black condition in these different decades, different centuries? And so, once I started organizing the book, different things I wanted to talk about and explore would have a conversation with each other and tell me where they should go in the book.
There's a huge literature that many of us are familiar with of writing about slavery, films about slavery. I think many Indian readers might be familiar with, say, Toni Morrison's Beloved, with films like 12 Years a Slave. Were you conscious of that sort of canon, I suppose? And were there things in that canon that you wanted to borrow or lean on or avoid in writing this book?
Well, sometimes when I'm working on something, I want to know what folks have done before. Sometimes I don't. In this case, I thought I'll reread some of the classics. I hadn't read Beloved by Toni Morrison in 30 years, so I thought I'd read that and see how she dealt with the subject. I was going to go back and read The Known World by Edward P. Jones, The Middle Passage by Charles Johnson. And I got 30 pages into Beloved, and I was like, fuck it, I'm totally screwed. You can't really beat, Toni Morrison. So I stopped reading it. And I was very disheartened for a while. But then, I sort of remembered something when I started out that helped me when I was beginning as a writer. And it was the realization that no matter what you're writing about, whether it's slavery or World War II or family, someone smarter and more talented than you has already done it. So don't worry about it. Just do the best you can. You can't really outdo Toni Morrison. You can't really outdo Homer. Homer, kind of a master. His work has stood the test of time. So if you just trust that you have your own sort of perspective to bring to all these stories that have been told, for so many years, it takes the pressure off.
I was thinking about Beloved as I read this book, and what is one of the main differences is, for me, is actually the amazing lyricism you manage in actually a very energetic, direct style of prose. I think it's quite extraordinary, actually. But at a larger level, the Underground Railroad as a feature of the way American history is taught is part of a kind of redemptive narrative of America. It offers a sense of, America's better angels, of a more hopeful imagining of what America can be. And I got the sense in reading the book that actually you're pushing against that you're not trying to find that sort of more, Cora, your main character, puzzles over the word optimistic at some point of the book. And my sense was that actually one of the things you're showing here is that American vision of itself as a redemptive project is very unfulfilled.
Well, I mean, I think, because the book keeps rebooting from state to state, it has a big cast of characters. So there are villainous white characters, heroic white characters, villainous black characters, heroic black characters. And I think I hopefully get a big portrait of what it was actually like to grapple with the problem of slavery. And as modern readers, we can ask ourselves, what would we have done? If you're white, would you have been an abolitionist or gone with the order? How do you reckon with the fact, if you're from a Southern family, that your great-grandfather raped, tortured, brutalized people for money? As a 21st century black American, would you have run? There's one kind of heroism in running. There's also a heroism in staying and protecting your family and being part of the community and helping each other. And I think, with what's going on in America now, what are we doing to stop the immigrant incarcerations? What are we doing about various things that are happening being perpetuated by the Trump administration? We could be in one of those moments where we have to ask ourselves, what can we do to step up and be counted and contribute what we can? And so, going back, I think the book is big enough to have these different sort of points of view, hopeful, not so hopeful.
Now that it's thundering, I thought it might be appropriate to ask you about the character of Ridgway, the slave catcher, who I imagine I believe the book has been optioned for TV, I can imagine being quite a spectacular figure in the TV show. You describe him, when he is this sort of forbidding slave catcher figure who chases Cora from state to state and comes in and out of the narrative. You sort of attach him to this idea of what you call the American imperative. I wonder if I could ask you to talk a little bit about that.
No, sure. The hard thing about writing a novel is that it takes a long time. But the good thing is that if you get stuck, you can just keep going and figure out the problem later. So with Ridgway, he was sort of the hardest character for me to figure out. When I got to page 77, when he's supposed to appear, I didn't really know how he walked and talked, so I just wrote, insert Ridgway, introduction someday, and kept going with South Carolina. And then doing some research helped me figure him out. Cora is a very strong character, so I wanted a very strong villain to stand up to her. And so I knew I wanted him to articulate an idea about imperialism, white supremacy, manifest destiny, and hopefully as he sort of unveils his warped philosophy across the book, he's a worthy adversary for Cora. And the Tennessee section where they sort of finally meet each other, I sort of see as a sort of blasted wasteland. In the book, it's been ravaged by yellow plague and wildfire. And I guess I was sort of picturing Waiting for Godot, these two figures, Cora and Ridgway, sort of in this blasted plain, debating what it is to be American, what it is to be, what freedom is.
You would have written this book before the election of Trump. But do you feel that in any way its reception has been colored by that political moment in the United States? And also, when you were writing the book, were you thinking about Black Lives Matter and contemporary? You were so immersed in the history of the country. Were you also thinking very much about contemporary political movements and controversies?
Yeah, not so much. Sometimes I am writing about what's going on now, and sometimes I'm not. In the case of this book, the events in Ferguson happened in 2014, the summer before I started writing, and Black Lives Matter sort of sprouted into existence. But growing up in America, the fact that we have a very terrible and pronounced police brutality problem is not news to me. And so the revelations of Black Lives Matter may have been surprising to some people, but not me. Obviously, there's parallels between, say, the slave patrollers in the book who had the license to stop any black person, free or slave, and demand to see their free papers. There's a parallel between them and some white law enforcement now. And as someone who's been stopped and handcuffed and interrogated for being black in the wrong place, I didn't have to force those comparisons. They're sort of readily available. In terms of how the book has changed after Trump's election, if you write a book about white supremacy and then we elect a white supremacist president, it does sort of change how it's interpreted. And for me, definitely, I started reading different sections once he got elected. There's a character named Lander who's a sort of Du Boisian progressive figure, and some of his speeches made more sense for me to read at readings and lectures. They're sort of hopeful, they're ambiguous, and they sort of describe the sort of in-between place we are now. So my own interpretation of the book has changed with Trump's election.
Well, actually, you mentioned Lander's speech, and towards the end of the book, there's an interesting tension between the figure of Lander and another character called Mingo. Sort of the tension between, I guess, an approach that emphasizes accommodation versus assertion of blacks within a larger white society. I wonder if you actually would be interested. I think we have time. Would you want to read a little bit from that speech to give us a sense of what's happening there?
Surely.
I hope everybody's not getting too drenched or blown away by this storm.
So Cora has had many different adventures. Now she's in Indiana, which for many years in my notes was Black Utopia, ? She's found herself in a free black community. They're self-sufficient. They have a farm, they take in strays, they take in runaway slaves, and you can stay and become part of their community or keep going on to the next stop in your journey. And every Saturday they have music, they have speakers, and a feast. And on this day, a conservative voice named Mingo has given his idea of what's next for Valentine Farm, and by extension, black folks in general in 1850. And then Lander, who's a more sort of progressive voice, sort of borrowing from Du Bois, gives his idea. Brother Mingo made some good points, Lander said. We can't save everyone, but that doesn't mean we can't try. Sometimes a useful delusion is better than a useless truth. Here's one delusion, that we can escape slavery. We can't. Its scars will never fade. When you saw your mother sold off, your father beaten, your sister abused by some boss or master, did you ever think that you'd sit here today without chains, without the yoke, among a new family? Everything you ever knew told you freedom was a trick, yet here you are. Still we run, tracking by the good full moon to sanctuary. Valentine Farm, this place, is a delusion too. Who told you the Negro deserved a place of refuge? Who told you that you had that right? Every minute of your life's suffering has argued otherwise. For every fact of history, it can exist. This place must be a delusion too, yet here we are. And America too is a delusion, the grandest one of all. The white race believes with all its heart that it is their right to take the land, to kill Indians, make war, enslave their brothers. This nation shouldn't exist if there's any justice in the world, for its foundations are murder, theft, and cruelty. Yet here we are. I'm supposed to answer Mingo's call for gradual progress, for closing our doors to those in need. I'm supposed to answer those who think this place is too close to the grievous influence of slavery and that we should move west. I don't have an answer for you. I don't know what we should do. The word we. In some ways, the only thing we have in common is the color of our skin. Our ancestors came from all over the African continent. It's quite large. Brother Valentine has the maps of the world in his splendid library. You can look for yourself. They had different customs, different ways of subsistence, spoke 100 different languages. And that great mixture was brought to America in the holds of slave ships. To the north, to the south. Their sons and daughters picked tobacco, cultivated cotton, worked on the largest estates and the smallest farms. We are craftsmen and midwives and preachers and peddlers. Black hands built the White House, the seat of our nation's government. The word we. We are not one person, but one people, but many different people. How can one person speak for this great, beautiful race, which is not one race but many, with a million desires and hopes and wishes for ourselves and our children? For we are Africans in America, something new in the history of the world, without models for what we will become. Color must suffice. It's brought us to this night, this discussion, and it'll take us into the future. All I truly know is that we rise and fall as one colored family living next door to one colored white family. We may not know our way through the forest, but we can pick each other up when we fall, and we will arrive together.
That's great. This book really doesn't pull punches in excoriating the American delusion. I wonder, in taking it around the country, did you encounter pushback from readers or critics who weren't willing to go so far, or maybe took it personally?
Well, I think if you write nonfiction, people come out and protest your book. If you write fiction, nobody really cares, and so if people show up, they're engaged and want to hear you talk. They're not there to, argue with you about was the Civil War fought over states' rights or slavery. So, if people show up, they're on your side. I hadn't been asked to read a lot in the South, and with this book, that really changed. And so, there are definitely parts of the South that are really open to reckoning with their history, and some parts not. I've read like 6 times in North Carolina, South Carolina since the book came out. I have not in Mississippi. So different, parts of the South are having their own sort of accommodation with their history. I find in general in the States and also other countries, the whiter the country, the weirder the question, or whiter the county. And so I'm supposed to, we talk about the book for 5 minutes and then I become like the spokesman for all Black America and they can ask any questions they have about Black culture. Why is Barack Obama considered Black if he has a white mom? And it's like, I only have 20 minutes, I can't really get into that. Was it right for Kendrick Lamar to win the Pulitzer? He's a rapper, is rap a real musical form? And rappers use the N-word, isn't that bad? That's like a 3-part question, So the less acquaintance a place has with Black culture, the weirder the questioning gets usually.
You're in India right now, and I'm sure this book has taken you elsewhere. I'm curious, when you write a book like this or your other novels, do you write with an audience in mind? Do you write with a national audience in mind? Or who are you writing to?
Sure, I think when I started with my first book, The Intuitionist, I thought my ideal reader would be like a 16-year-old Black weirdo who might pick it up and think, oh, I like this guy, maybe I'll become a writer too. And then it came out and there were no 16-year-old weirdos, Black or otherwise, in the audience. And I realized that I'm always like gaining and losing audiences. I got a new audience with Sag Harbor, which is like a realistic coming-of-age story about growing up in the 80s. Then I wrote a book about zombies, and people were like, oh, I hate zombies, I don't want to read you anymore. And then more people came along for this book. So I've learned that I'm always disappointing people, and readers come and go, so if I just don't think about them, it's probably better. In terms of different countries, I didn't think about it when I was writing it, but one, the master-slave dynamic. The dynamic between the oppressors and the oppressed exists in all cultures. So whether you're in China mapping your own history onto the book, that power dynamic allows you to inhabit it, even if you know nothing about American slavery. And then, it was interesting in France and Poland because they connected the abolitionists to the French resistance, the Polish resistance against the Nazis, hiding people, subverting the power. And so I don't think about the audience, but I was really surprised and very happily surprised about how different people could map their own histories onto it.
Your books in the past have won many awards and you've received a lot of acclaim, but it's probably fair to say that this book has sort of catapulted you to a kind of a different level of success. What's that experience been like? as a writer, as somebody who has to shepherd this book into the world? What's that been like?
I'm in a much better mood these days than I, did for what I was in for many decades. I think before all the good stuff happened, I'd wake up like 5 a.m., like tortured, like, I'm a terrible writer, I'm a terrible parent, Now I wake up at 5 a.m. and I'm like, oh, sweet mystery of life, at last I found you, and I feel a lot different about things.
I'm glad you sang, because I was amused to read in the acknowledgments of the book that that you listen to particular songs at particular times of the writing. Could you sketch that out for us?
Well, I grew up in New York, and there's always like some noise around, whether it's like a car alarm or a police siren, your neighbor being choked to death upstairs, and their screams echoing through the hallways. And so I've always done my homework, with music or in front of the TV. In college, I did my coursework in front of the TV. And now, when I write, I have like a 3,000 song iTunes playlist. And it goes from hip hop to Edith Piaf to the Misfits and Sonic Youth. And the songs keep me company. They're songs I'm listening to for decades, and they energize me. And so I don't always do acknowledgments, but David Bowie died, I guess like 3 years ago and like 4 days ago. So I figured I would thank David Bowie, because I was listening to him for 35 years. And also thank Prince and Sonic Youth, because whenever I get to the last page of a book, I put on Daydream Nation and Purple Rain. And that's my final day music. It means I didn't get hit by a bus, and I made it to the end of the book. And so I thanked Sonic Youth and Prince, and then Prince died. And I was like, am I like the angel of death? Like, what's going on here? Like, Sonic Youth, watch out. But I wanted to just thank some of the artists, and I've been asked, like, I thank the Misfits in the acknowledgments, and people have asked, like, where did the Misfits influence appear in the book? And there's no one place. I was just listening to a lot of Misfits when I was writing the book. But I wanted to thank these artists who have sustained me.
I'd like to ask you a little bit about New York. You've written, this is a city you grew up in, you're born and raised there. I'm curious, and I always, maybe from the particular childhood I had, I always felt that New York was a place askew from the rest of the country. I wonder if that was the... Have we lost power? And if so, where does that place you as a writer who's writing about America, to America, to be a writer in New York?
Well, I mean, it's my hometown, and I get a lot of creative energy from being there. And sometimes I write about New York, and sometimes I don't. I keep sort of trying to figure out how to write a contemporary New York novel, and never ends up working out. The Intuitionist takes place in alternative New York, in a kind of amorphous 20th century. Zone 1 takes place in my idealized utopian New York. It's after the apocalypse and everyone's dead and no one can bother you. But there's something about writing about New York now that I always sort of avoid. But we sort of talk about the Colossus of New York, which is my book of essays about the city. And it is about New York, but it's really about any place that you love. And so the section on rush hour is New York rush hour, but it's also Paris rush hour and Jaipur. It's really about a place you love and the kind of feelings you have when you walk around and see something has replaced your old movie theater or your old barber shop, and try to map the previous versions of the city on what's there now, the same way that the world is always trying to map previous versions of yourself onto you. And so I keep coming back to New York and find different ways of trying to talk about it. And I guess if I ever get it right, I'll stop.
In the few minutes we have left before we have to open out open the floor to questions, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your next book, which is coming out in the summer, The Nickel Boys.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess I usually do a book that has more jokes and a book that has less jokes. And definitely, The Underground Railroad has the lowest number of jokes per page of anything I've done. So I was all psyched to do something different, like I was going to write this 60s crime novel, and then as a nice sort of antidote. And then Trump got elected, and I was like, fuck, now I gotta write about how our country's all fucked up again. So it's based on a true story. There's a reform school in Florida called the Dozier School for Boys. And you could be sent there for stealing a hubcap, or if you were an orphan or a ward of the state, they send you to this school. And it looks very beautiful from the outside. But of course, as happens in a lot of these kinds of institutions where people aren't being supervised, whether it's a reform school or an orphanage, there's a lot of abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and some of the guards over the years killed a lot of students and buried them in a secret graveyard. And it was finally closed in 2011, and the adult survivors, people in their 50s and 60s who'd been, had their life's course altered by being at this school, came forward and they dug up the graves and finally exposed what happened to this school over all the years. So I read about the school and came up with my own sort of based on version, and it's about two kids who were sent to a place like that in the 1960s. It's Jim Crow era Florida, and one kid gets sort of sent there by accident through a chain of misfortunes, and then another kid is an orphan on his own and is more sort of streetwise, and there are different sort of ways of looking at the world inform the book, and one person gets out and one doesn't.
Great, we're looking forward to it, and I think now it's time to ask some questions. So, you have the mic. Raise your hands and we'll get to you.
Hi, I'm a non-white American and I'm shit scared. Are you?
Shit scared? Yeah, in general, yeah, pretty much.
In writing such Colin writing such a moving and a very disturbing novel. I'm sure you yourself go through a depression. How do you come out of it, and how long do you take?
Well, I mean, you're talking about it was disturbing, so I think emotionally it was hard material to deal with. It was really compartmentalized because I could put the violence on the page every day and then stop working and hang out with my family, and it was very separate. And I think, as I was saying before, I did all the sort of heavy lifting before I started writing, reconciling myself what I had to put on the page to be realistic. We talked about 12 Years a Slave. I had a weird experience in watching that movie. I got 100 pages into the book, and I'd avoided watching it. And I figured, I sort of know what the book is. I can watch it. I won't be able to get an idea, but I know what the book is, and I won't get infected with this other version of slavery. And I couldn't get to the whole movie. I could only get through an hour. And I could write these scenes of brutality, but watching an actor go through it, and I know they're actors, was too much. And it'll be a while before I probably see a movie about slavery or a TV show, just because it is too much to see it on a screen, even though I can read about it and write about it. And you asked, I wasn't sure if you were asking us about how long it took. I had the idea in the back of my head for like 14 years, and then a year of writing is how long it took to write it.
Hi. Could Cora not have survived?
Well, we don't want to give away the ending.
No, I love the ending. I think it was a remarkable book, but the lack of redemption, as you talked about earlier, part of me made up my own ending
Well,
It was marvelous.
I think, you know, with Cora, she does encounter different forms of freedom, and they're challenged and rejected. And finally, in the last couple of pages, we find her in a different place, and she's no longer on the Randall plantation. And people do want to know sort of what happens next. Even if she goes to, say, San Francisco, wins the lottery, is like a millionaire, finds someone to love, a man or a woman, has kids, she's still a black woman in 1850s America, which is an incredibly racist place to be. And so even if everything turns out swell, she's still in America. And maybe that's the punchline, I guess. But, you know, I sort of take her as far as I can go, and I was writing for that moment for a long time.
Hello, Mr. Whitehead. So, I have many questions. I finished your book just this morning, but the most pressing one is, and I'm sure you've been asked this question several times, is, well, you mentioned research several times during your conversation, and I'm sure it took a lot of fact-finding to write a book as deeply intensive as this one. So, I wondered why the railroad is almost like a character in the book, in the fact that it surfaces every now and then to give hope to Cora and ultimately leads her to freedom, the tunnel, the railroad. So I wondered what prompted you to use an actual railroad rather than the historical factuality.
Sure. I mean, you know, I had the idea to make the metaphor into a literal train, and so from its very conception, the book is fantastic. It's not a realistic story of a slave running north. There's this huge train in it. So from the very moment I had the idea, it was not going to be a realistic story. And if I'd stuck to what happened, I couldn't have the play with history that I think, for me, makes the novel very vital. By mixing and matching things, I can make my own sort of narrative about how America came to be. I think the North Carolina section is a good example. I mentioned Harriet Jacobs, who wrote a slave narrative, and in her story of her escaping from the plantation, she ran from her master, hid 7 years in an attic before she got passage to the north. And you know, the modern reader thinks hiding in an attic and frank. And so through that sort of slippage, that common experience of hiding from oppressors, I was able, if I sort of pulled it out and expanded it, I could compare the domination and oppression of Jewish people in the 20th century Europe with the oppression of black people in the 19th century. The Nazis took their ideas about race purity, eugenics, and patrolling people's bodies from 19th century American racial scientists who developed racist theories to justify the enslavement of black people. They took our Jim Crow laws in the South, restricting black movement, lynching culture, and took it to its logical extreme, which is the Holocaust. And America was very much a model for what the Nazis did. So if I stuck to a realistic story, I couldn't move things around to make those sort of connections.
Hello. Two questions. Am I audible? Yeah. First, has Marx been an influence on your writing and your work? If so, how? And secondly...
Karl Marx?
Yes. And yeah, in a deeply capitalist environment like the US, what do you think going forward are the solutions to global inequity, according to you?
Yeah, I'm just some guy who sits in his house making up stuff, so I have no cure to a global capitalist system, unfortunately. But if you have any ideas, you can tell me later. In terms of studying Marx, you know, I sort of study Marx secondhand from people who actually read Marx, and then their ideas entered into culture. I think we all sort of know the basic tenets of socialism. in coming to the material in my 40s. Obviously, there's a link between capitalism and slavery. And in the first 5 pages of the book, hopefully I make it very clear that Cora and her family have been reduced to commodities, and they're sold. They have prices based on whether you're a physically able male, a woman of childbearing age, old and infirm. And the history of America is capitalism, and one of its main engines was slavery. And so the line in the book about stolen bodies working stolen land, I think is sort of one element, and the other is capitalism.
I'm a huge fan. Barry Jenkins is doing a limited series of your book. How do you think your book would translate into a visual format, especially since the metaphor is at the center of the book?
Yeah, I mean, usually my books have too many black people in them, adapted into film or television. So I was pleasantly surprised when the interest in this one film company kept continuing. So it's being adapted into a miniseries by Barry Jenkins, who did Moonlight and If Beale Street Can Talk, and I'm very excited. And it's a different thing to write on the page and to put on the screen. I mentioned Cora being in the attic in North Carolina, of Anne Frank and also Harriet Jacobs. And in the book, you can have 70 pages of someone being stuck in a room, and it's very static. They can remember things, they can see things, they can process the world. But on film, that's really boring. And so he's the task of making that very static scene into something dynamic. And he told me his ideas for that scene. I was like, oh, that's really good. Like, that would never occur to me, but you, a filmmaker, sort of solved the problem. We talked about Ridgway briefly and him as a character in the film. I have talked about some things. I've been ignored in other moments. I had an idea that there's an actor named Walton Goggins, who's like sort of always plays like the white redneck. And I thought that he could play all the white characters in the movie, sort of like Eddie Murphy in Meet the Clumps or whatever. So he could be like an old white lady, he could be a white child, and this were makeup and prosthetics. And weirdly, they never got back to me about that idea when I told them about it.
Are you going to be involved in the writing of the series?
Just like the occasional consultation, you know, I sort of did it once.
We have some minutes left. Maybe we can collect 3 questions at a time and give them to Colson.
So you mentioned also a few questions back. Sometimes films like 12 Years, etc., which depict violence. Sorry. Yeah. Like, is there a better mic? That depict again slaves really in very graphic manner can get very disturbing even for you to read. And even this book has certain graphic depictions of violence. So my question is basically is that when you're writing, where do you draw the line about it becoming too much? Because there's also an importance of depicting the realities that were going on at the time, because that's also something that's, you know, there is a necessity to talk about that, but also
sure, yeah.
At what point does it become too much so that, you know, it almost doesn't become like sensationalistic?
Sure, I mean,
do you want to respond to that now, or do you mind collecting a few?
Okay, sure. So there's a violence depiction?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure.
So my question is, in your book, hello?
Just keep speaking. These microphones are cutting out a little bit, but just keep speaking.
At the start of every chapter, there are certain advertisement which is mentioning so-and-so has run away and so much is prize money. So from where you get the idea of putting those? Have you studied actual advertisements? And if you see the course of the book, the language of the advertisements are changing, and it actually tells the story of the book. So I quite like that particular.
Okay. And then one more?
And we'll take one more in the back on this side. Yeah.
Hi, I recently got introduced to Catherine Stockett's The Help, and that's my introduction to Black American literature.
She's white, actually.
Yeah, I mean the content, like black people in the Mississippi, that's what she talked about.
We gotta start somewhere.
So what is your, what are the books, what are the contemporary literature books that inspire you? The contemporary black literature books that...
I'll start with the violence. Depiction of violence, how do you handle it? Different stories demand different ways of speaking, different kinds of narrators. My book about the zombie apocalypse, Zone 1, has one way of dealing with violence. It's sort of like movie violence. In coming up with the language for this book, I was influenced by slave narratives and how slaves actually described what happened to them. You could, in a slave narrative, see two sentences that might be like, my mother was beaten to death in the fields, and the next day I started picking cotton for the first time. And it's only two sentences, but it contains so much. And you don't have to sell the violence or the brutality or the depravity. It speaks for itself. And so reading, many oral histories of slaves in their own words, that sort of matter-of-factness came across, and that became a feature of my narrator. So the story always determines what kind of tools you use, and that's one question. So the slave advertisements. Before the start of each state chapter, there's a reproduction of slave advertisements, and they're real. As a writer, I like doing impressions of how people talk, figuring out how people talk in different ways. And I came across these slave ads. They were digitized by the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And I knew that I couldn't compete with these terse, sort of 8-line descriptions of runaway slaves. They contain so much, $25 reward for Bessie. She has a scar on her arm from a burn. How'd she get it? Has a downcast expression. Well, we know why she's downcast. Last seen in the vicinity of the colored community in Edmonton. Well, what's that community like? So I couldn't compete, and copyright laws being what they were, I could just take them and stick them in the book. Everyone's dead. No one's going to sue. They do change over time. The last runaway slave ad is Cora. And of course, it's her masters never wrote a slave advertisement like the one that's in there, affirming her humanity, saying that she was never free. And it doesn't make sense in terms of the reality of the book. It's really me, Colson, apologizing to Cora for everything that's happened. Right before we get to that runaway slave ad, many terrible things have happened in Indiana. Mabel has come back. And I felt really bad writing her into that corner. So that last runaway slave ad is just me talking to my fictional creation and apologizing. The last question for the gentleman who was introduced to the Black experience by Catherine Stockett's The Help. There are many different kinds of African-American writers. And your question cut out, so I wasn't sure if you wanted tips on Black writers. On my trip here, I brought a book by Terrence Hayes. It's a sort of biographical sketch of the Black poet Etheridge Knight. So that's one book I'm reading now. I find inspiration by many different kinds of writers, not just African American. I've mentioned Toni Morrison and Edward P. Jones. For this Underground Railroad, Garcia Marquez's brand of magic realism is very helpful. Harmonies of Solitude, his deadpan way of mixing the real and the fake was a good model for me, and mixing the real and the fake in this book. I follow an account on Twitter that just tweets out lines from Moby Dick. And I would say, if you want some recommendations on authors, Terrence Hayes, Herman Melville, and Garcia Marquez. And you can skip the Catherine Stockett. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thank you, Colson. And continue enjoying the festival despite the rain.
We wish to thank Colson Whitehead and Kanishk Tharoor and our sponsor, the Embassy of the United States of America, for this session. Do note that the author will be signing their books at the book signing kiosk. Autograph requests sadly will not be possible at this time. Thank you. पीछे करो उसको दो पीछे लेके जाओ ऑब्वियसली